Hi, I'm Ethan King, a PhD candidate at Boston University, where I'm finishing a dissertation entitled Under Construction, Infrastructural Fictions Across the 20th Century. My dissertation approaches infrastructure as a formal and political concern of global Anglophone literary fiction, and recognizes infrastructural networks as sites of power that facilitate or foreclose types of belonging. My talk today offers an exploratory glimpse into my work on William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. This talk will explore the material and social geographies of the U.S. South in the early 20th century through two specific events: the construction of highways from the Good Roads movement and the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. As upheavals in the southern landscape, these events altered notions of national belonging, socioeconomic possibility, and political and human security. For William Faulkner, these events haunt As I Lay Dying, a novel replete with references to roads and floods. The Good Roads movement and the Mississippi River Commission implemented infrastructural developments that were motivated by political rhetoric that promised the good life of being modern and belonging to the future. Oftentimes, developers and policymakers promote ideas of democratic access, modern convenience, and improved security through infrastructure. However, the promise of infrastructure, I argue, often bears a cruel, obverse reality, primarily through infrastructure's production of injustice and environmental devastation. In other words, despite the aspirational qualities of infrastructure, its development often carries irrevocable social and environmental consequences. For those less familiar with Faulkner, As I Lay Dying is a novel told through a series of monologues from multiple perspectives about a poor rural farming family who, after their matriarch Addie dies, travel from an isolated hamlet in Yoknapatawpha County to the city of Jefferson to fulfill her wish to be buried there. The novel manifests infrastructure's cruelty, I contend, through the poorly maintained rural road systems that proved disastrous for the Bungeon's journey to the city and the nation at large. Originally, the objective of Southern road development at the turn of the century was to assist farmers by improving the material conditions for transporting crops. However, the Good Roads movement reoriented itself away from farm-to-market infrastructure and instead toward the construction of tourist highways. Significantly, Faulkner juxtaposes every reference to good roads with references to local weather and floods, charting a connection between infrastructural projects of road construction with the Great Mississippi Flood. One of the greatest disasters to afflict the United States, the protracted flood devastated the lower Mississippi Valley, displacing hundreds of thousands of people and submerging more than 20,000 square miles of land. It was caused by a slew of environmental interventions: the improper implementation of levees, regional deforestation, monoculture farming, and, according to Faulkner's novel, road construction. I argue that Faulkner's novel represents how these roads and floods destabilized the South's rural communities, ultimately marking the Bungeon's entrance into the nation as traumatic. Typically, communities not connected to the nation-state by roads see themselves as marginalized by their absence. The Good Roads movement, a confluence of Northern reformers and New South progressives, endeavored to solve this issue, associating its aims with notions of development, improvement, and modernity. The roads they intended to develop became political sites of aspiration, trying to incorporate rural Southerners more fully into the nation. Despite rhetoric that appealed to poor farmers for improving rural roads, improvements only came to interstate highways, benefiting tourist markets and automobile owners, ushering in an era of increasing standardization for travel between regions. The Good Roads movement acted contrary to their goals for improved rural wagon travel. Like many road-building projects initially aimed at repairing uneven geographies of mobility, they ultimately failed to address the historically entrenched inequalities between the country and the city. In As I Lay Dying, Faulkner comments on the Good Road movement from multiple perspectives, voicing protest and support respectively for the federally funded roadways. Neighbors Ants Bungeon and Vernontal act as historical nodes in local and national debates about public infrastructure. In fact, Faulkner's initial conception of the novel, as Alan Tate recalls, began with Ants's "Darn that road" diatribe. Ants, a resentful farmer, believes that roads only bring bad luck and economic destitution. He aims his vitriol most forcefully at the effects of roads on his family's farming. He blames, for example, the roads for his son Cash, quote, having to get them carpenter notions, and for his son Darl's drafting into World War I, both of which had caused a labor shortage on the farm. Ance's protest stems from a feeling of subservience, from a transition from local autonomy to national governance. The new roadways widen the environs of which he is a part, a modern public that is thickening with new socioeconomic and political networks. These new developments deprive Ance of what little power, privacy, and autonomy he had as a poor farmer. As John Matthews puts it, quote, Ance blames the expansion of state authority for his troubles. It is state paternalism in the 20s and 30s that replaces and exposes as arbitrary the individual father's authority in the modernized United States. In contrast to Ance, Vernon Tull participates within these emerging networks and comes to defend the roads. For example, before the Bundrans embark for Jefferson, Tull assuages Ance's anxieties about the funeral journey. Quote, with the roads like they are now, he says, it won't take you no time to get her to town. The roads like they are now obviously refers to recent improvements in rural infrastructure. Later, when the same scene is narrated again from a different perspective, the dialogue changes. This time Tull says, quote, but the roads is good now. Faulkner transforms Tull's qualifying clause, the roads like they are now, into the more assertive, the roads is good now. This verbal transformation emphasizes a rhetorical movement toward good roads. The sentence is reformed by Faulkner as a way to call attention to the good roads movement and how they have apparently ensured the good quality of the roads. As Tull participates in a more modern agronomic economy, it makes sense that he defends the new roads of the U.S. South, touting the now of the South's nascent modernity with its new possibilities for socioeconomic exchange and national belonging. But despite Tull's repetition of good roads movement rhetoric, the roads the Bundrans traverse have not been maintained at all, which causes their wagon to break down multiple times, signaling the gap between the modern accessibility that the building of roads suggested and the possibility of the rural poor to use them successfully. A journey that ought to take them no more than 2 days by mule-drawn wagon takes nearly 2 weeks. The poor road quality creates the feeling that progress, narratively and materially, is not taking place, if not together impossible. If Tull's rhetoric insists on a kind of faith in modern development, by a cruel twist of fate, it's clear that modern development and its material forms of progress have not come to the isolated hamlets that rural farmers like the Bundrans call home. What makes the southern roadways so impassable in the novel are the after effects of a storm the night Addie dies. As I mentioned, Faulkner attaches references to this storm to every reference to the good roads movement in the novel. After Tull says, for example, the roads is good now, he thinks to himself, it's fixing to rain tonight. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the novel, a comment on the roads followed by a comment on the storm, which yokes weather patterns into the infrastructural geographies of the South. The effects of the storm are both immediate and long-term. Neighbors report that the river's rising waters have washed out a bridge, causing the Bundrans to reroute their journey. The road's deep, muddy rivulets break their wagon's wheel, causing further delay and further expense. Like Addie's corpse, the roads are in a state of decomposition. The washed-out bridge, quote, hadn't had a hammer to it in 25 years and was doubtful to be rebuilt, suggesting the lack of care for rural infrastructure, leaving the material spaces of transport for rural Southerners in disrepair. Elsewhere, Faulkner describes the region's harsh weather as, quote, slow, violent, shaping and creating the life of man, a description that calls to mind Rob Nixon. But like Rob Nixon's slow violence, the novel doesn't just show how weather affects man-made structures like roads and bridges, it also shows how infrastructural development shapes weather patterns and ecological systems, positioning infrastructure in the environment as co-constitutive. To understand the flood that occupies the dramatic center of the novel, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, we must understand how it happened. According to Susan Scott Parrish, quote, because the Mississippi watershed is a continental land feature funneling matter, and material practices of the north, west, and east into the Gulf South, its hydrogeography turned the river's delta into a place that made national environmental regimes visible. The Mississippi River Commission, a bureaucratic entity comprised of officials from states along the river, followed policies that closed the river off from its natural outlets and reservoirs, engineered levees as the sole means by which to control the river's flow, and enacted industrial deforestation and wetlands drainage to clear millions of acres for development, road building, and population resettlement. In theory, these shifts were designed to make the river more predictable and thus more secure for nearby regions. However, they were also designed to make the lands of the watershed much more profitable. Because profit often trumps protection, these changes in the built environment made the southernmost region of the Mississippi Valley much more vulnerable to flooding, because the volume of the water in the river, along with its current, increased dramatically the further south it went, creating a precarious situation for the poor whites and African Americans who lived in the Mississippi Delta. Once northern levees broke down due to higher volumes and faster currents, it was inevitable that this disaster would come to the deep south. In the novel, these changes in land use resemble Tull's lumber practices. Capitalizing on the timber resources of his land, Tull reenacts the practice of southern states selling the region's forest to northern industries. We learn about Tull's lumber practices in relation to both roadwork and flood control through Cash and Darrell, who late in the novel are trying to find the ford to cross the flooded river in their wagon. Quote, Tull taken and cut them 2 big white oaks. At high water in the old days, they used to line up the ford by them trees. Through their conversation, we see how Tull contributes locally in the deforestation of the region's watershed, and we see the imbricated effects of the timber industry, the construction of roads, and flood management. Tull's practices are merely a microcosm of the kind of environmental interventions taking place, but they provide an anthropogenic explanation for why the flooding is so bad. The flooded river itself is presented through a narrative triptych, with 3 different perspectives representing the Bundrans' failed attempt to ford the river safely. A fellow looking at it, Tull explains, quote, couldn't tell where was the river and where the land. It was just a tangle of yellow, and the levee less wide than a knife back. There is an aura of catastrophe, as the flood is variously described as, quote, the place where the motion of the wasted world accelerates just before the final precipice, and as, in the thick water, the shape of disaster, which they could not speak. Of course, the wagon cannot cross the flood. When a log knocks them into the river, Addie's coffin and the Bundrans' mules surge downstream. Although they recover Addie's waterlogged corpse, Cash has broken his leg, and they have lost their mules. Injured and bereft of their possessions, the Bundrans continue their journey to Jefferson as traumatized victims of disaster. As if to reinforce the Bundrans' spectral relation to the metropolitan center, the townspeople they encounter are unable to identify them, envisaging them as alien or as half-evolved grotesques, to borrow Matthew's phrase. The townspeople's inability to identify them signals the Bundrans as others, and Hossam Abu Layla rightly points out that this othering occurs at the level of narrative perspective. Much of the book is narrated by the Bundrans themselves, but post-flood, the remainder of the novel is narrated in large part by town dwellers. This shift reinforces the peripheralized position of the Bundrans and other rural points of view. The shift in narrative perspective also performs a national allegory for the technological meaning-making of the Mississippi flood and its victims. Similar to how new roads were intended to connect the country to the city, but failed, the flood connected country to the city and more, the south to the north, vis-a-vis its newspaper and radio reporting, but only in as much as it proved to be a gripping narrative of the United States' internal other for northern and urban consumption. Witnessing the Bundrans' abjection, Addie's putrefied corpse, and Cash's broken leg encased in cement, the townspeople feel threatened by their presence in the city, and they begin to racialize the Bundrans as black. Vardaman and a town storekeeper, for example, used racist epithets to describe the blackened appearance of Cash's gangrenous leg and Jules' burns, not to mention Dewey Dell's desires for abortion pills. The representation of poor rural whites seamlessly slips into a racial and racist discourse that endeavors to marginalize the Bundrans. Because the presence of rural poor prompts the townspeople hostility, the town marshal threatens legal action, arguing that, quote, they're liable to jail for endangering the public health. Citing their endangering of public health, resonates with the experiences of displaced victims of the Mississippi flood. In the aftermath of the flood, tens of thousands developed pellagra, a disease in which sores erupt on the skin and form a thick, black crust. It's as if the Bundrans present visible symptoms of pellagra upon entering town, embodying the harsh consequences of infrastructural interventions with the environment, not to mention the social and environmental racism suggested by their blackened appearance. The marshal does not jail them, though, because to bring the entire Bundran clan into jail would be to recognize their citizenship through the nation's legal system. Their ostracization indicates their lack of recourse to the systems that acknowledge their national identity. Of course, this is not to say that their experience of social estrangement is totally consistent with Southern racism. I mean, after all, their whiteness does enable them to move from place to place without fear of being brutalized or lynched. But we do see that the movement of rural whites like the Bundrans into new spatial locations are policed by the state in a way that precludes their full entry into the modern nation. Although physically entering the spaces of the modernized US, the Bundrans do not have access to the utilities and privileges these spaces afford. In response to the marshal, Ance is defiant, arguing that his family has a right to the city. Interestingly, his appeal to the city marshal runs counter to his earlier invective against Rhodes, as he argues that his family is on, quote, a public street. It's a public street, the man says. I reckon we can stop to buy something same as every other man. Elsewhere, as we know, Ance has decried public roads, resenting the social and political and economic interactions they bring into being. In this moment, however, Ance advocates for the collective right to occupy the physical space of the public street, arguing for his family's right to the city through their purchasing power, indicating that they also have a right to spend their money, what little of it there is, where they choose. Altogether, Faulkner's novel gives body and voice to the multiplying subaltern publics of the U.S. South, who struggle to participate in the spatial politics of their region and of the nation. Through the Bundrans' journey to Jefferson, Faulkner narrativizes a tiered version of citizenship, dependent upon infrastructural access, provision, and protection. The development of roads in the U.S. South produce and reveal uneven access to working and environmentally sustainable infrastructures and the economic and social values that they bring. The Bundrans, like many poor farmers in the South, don't have access to the goods, services, and securities in common with their city counterparts. The point is that everyone must have access to properly functioning infrastructures, and that we must attend to the kinds of social displacements and environmental traumas engendered by infrastructural development. If the urban world operates on the presumed functioning of these infrastructures, those without access or without proper security are left even further behind and are disproportionately vulnerable to economic gaps and environmental risks. Policymakers, developers, and engineers from the Good Roads Movement and the Mississippi River Commission implemented infrastructural developments detached from the bitter social and environmental consequences of their designs. Faulkner's novel, on the other hand, provides an immediate and immersive experience of these consequences, showing how one particular family has suffered from the region's changing landscapes. Thank you.